General Audience number 7, October 31st, 1979. Today, we should return once more to the meaning of man's original solitude, which emerges above all from the analysis of the so-called Yahwist text of Genesis chapter 2. The biblical text allows us, as we have already noted in earlier reflections, to throw into relief not only consciousness of the human body — man is created in the visible world as a body among bodies — but also that of the body's own meaning. Taking into account the great conciseness of the biblical texts, admittedly one cannot extend this implication too far. It is certain, however, that here we touch the central problem of anthropology. Consciousness of the body seems to be identical in this case with the discovery of the complexity of one's own structure, which in the end, based on a philosophical anthropology, consists in the relation between body and soul. The Yahwist account expresses this complexity with its own language, that is, with its own terminology, by saying, "The Lord God formed man with dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." Genesis chapter 2, verses 7. Moreover, precisely this man, a living being, distinguishes himself continually from all other living beings of the visible world. The premise of this self-distinction on man's part is the fact that only he is able to cultivate the earth. See Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, and to subdue it. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. One can say that from the very beginning, the awareness of superiority inscribed in the definition of humanity has originated in a typically human praxis or behavior. This awareness brings with it a particular perception of the meaning of one's own body, which emerges precisely from the fact that it is man's task to cultivate the earth and to subdue it. All of this would be impossible without the typically human intuition of the meaning of one's own body. It seems, therefore, that we should speak primarily about this aspect, rather than about the problem of anthropological complexity in the metaphysical sense. If the original description of human consciousness reported by the Yahwist text includes also the body in the whole account, if it contains, as it were, the first witness of the discovery of one's own bodiliness, and even, as we said, the perception of the meaning of one's own body, all of this reveals itself not on the basis of some primordial metaphysical analysis, but on the basis of man's sufficiently clear, concrete subjectivity. Man is a subject, not only by his self-consciousness and by self-determination, but also based on his own body. The structure of this body is such that it permits him to be the author of genuinely human activity. In this activity, the body expresses the person. It is thus, in all its materiality, he formed man with dust of the ground, penetrable and transparent, as it were, in such a way as to make it clear who man is and who he ought to be, thanks to the structure of his consciousness and self-determination. On this rests the fundamental perception of the meaning of one's own body, which one cannot fail to discover when analyzing man's original solitude. The alternative between death and immorality? And so, with this fundamental understanding of the meaning of his own body as the subject of the ancient covenant with the Creator, man is placed in front of the mystery of the tree of knowledge. You may eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for when you eat of it you shall certainly die. Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. The original meaning of man's solitude rests on the experience of the existence he obtained from the Creator. This human existence is characterized precisely by subjectivity, which also includes the meaning of the body. Yet, could man, who in his original consciousness knows only the experience of existing, and thus of life, have understood what the words "you shall die" mean? Would he have been able to reach an understanding of the sense of these words through the complex structure of the life given to him when the Lord God blew into his nostrils the breath of life? One must suppose that this word, completely new, appeared on the horizon of man's consciousness without his ever having experienced the reality. and that at the same time this word appeared before him as a radical antithesis of all that man had been endowed with. For the first time, man heard the words, "You shall die," without having any familiarity with it in the experience he had up to this point. But on the other hand, he could not fail to associate the meaning of death with that dimension of life he had enjoyed up to that point. The words of God, Yahweh, addressed to the man, confirm a dependence in existing, so that they show man as a limited being, and by his nature, susceptible to non-existence. These words raised the problem of death in a conditional way. When you eat of it, you shall die. The man who had heard these words had to find their truth in the inner structure of his own solitude. After all, it depended on him, on his decision and free choice, whether he would enter with solitude also into the circle of the antithesis revealed to him by the Creator, together with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and would appropriate the experience of dying and of death. When he heard the words of God Yahweh, the man should have understood that the tree of knowledge had plunged its roots not only into the Garden of Eden, but also into his humanity. In addition, he should have understood that this mysterious tree concealed within itself a dimension of solitude that was unknown to him up to this point, a dimension with which the Creator had endowed him in the midst of the world of living beings, of the animals to which he, the man, had given names in the presence of the Creator himself, so as to come to understand that none of them was similar to him. When the fundamental meaning of his body had thus already been established through distinction from the rest of creatures, when it had become evident thereby that the invisible determines man more than the visible, then the alternative presented itself before him, strictly and directly linked by God Yahweh to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The alternative between death and immortality, which emerges from Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, goes beyond the essential meaning of the human body inasmuch as it picks up the eschatological meaning, not only of the body, but also of humanity itself, distinct from all the living beings from bodies. This alternative, however, regards in a quite particular way the body created from dust of the ground. In order not to prolong this analysis, we limit ourselves to observing that the alternative between death and immortality has entered from the very beginning into the definition of man, and that it belongs from the beginning to the meaning of his solitude before God himself. This original meaning of solitude, permeated by the alternative between death and immortality, also has a fundamental significance for the whole theology of the body. With this observation, we conclude for now our reflections on the meaning of man's original solitude. This observation, emerging in a clear and incisive way from the texts of Genesis, leads us to reflect on the texts as much as on man, who has perhaps too little consciousness of the truth that concerns him, and that is contained already in the first chapters of the Bible.